Hi, everyone. I'm Vladimir Jutia. We are watching all the news happening in the United States and around the world. For the next hour, you and I are going to talk about everything that's happening all over the world. Let's begin. U.S. tariffs on steel go into effect the same day new economic data is released. We're going to break down the better-than-expected CPI report and explain what it all means. Plus, the Department of Education slashes its staff, what it means for the future of the agency, and why the entire staff was told not to come into the office today. And waiting on Russia. Ukraine says it will agree to a ceasefire brokered by the U.S., but will Vladimir Putin sign off on it? We're going to tell you. This is CBS News 24/7. New economic data shows inflation has cooled in the last month, coming in lower than economists expected. But the prices at the register are still high. And now new tariffs have gone into effect. That happened today. It's an added 25% charge on aluminum and steel imports coming into the United States. And Canada is expected to announce more than $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs. But Wall Street seems to like the data so far. It's kind of a soft opening right now. They opened up slightly higher. They are down now, but we're going to keep an eye on that and obviously bring you developments as warranted. Dow relatively flat at the moment. So let's go to CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady, who's here with us to break it all down. So first, let's begin, Kelly, with that CPI report. What did we learn?
Okay, so came in lighter than expected. The headline number for an annual increase was 2.8%. That's down from 3% last month. Okay, so we're getting closer to the 2% target that the Fed likes to see. But we are
still 800 basis points.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of like a mini celebration, but let's not break the bank here. What I think was interesting is when you break it down, shelter accounted for nearly half of the increase that we saw in the month. And of course, that's been a big story. Housing, rent. I mean, that's just sort of a big cost for people. That's a need to have, not a nice to have. Airline fares, though, that's really where you saw a lot of the dip. It dropped 4% in the month alone. And so, as did gasoline. So a lot of economists I'm talking to, they're trying to parse out, was this just, well, the airlines are passing on that gasoline, that energy savings to the consumer, or is it slowing demand, which we have heard a lot of airlines talking about.
I would say, again, anecdotally, but maybe the numbers bear this out, that given the recent number of crashes that we've had here in the United States, that people are a little worried about flying. I can tell you, I just got on a plane. Everybody on my flight was sort of looking at each other, not worried per se, but it's in the back of your mind. And if you don't have to travel, maybe people are putting it off.
That's a possibility, and also I think there's just this, we've talked about the consumer sentiment numbers. People are starting to pull back a little bit. Maybe those vacations, spring break, summer break, they just are saying, okay, I'm going to drive or I'm not going to do something because I'm not sure what the economic future looks like when it comes to inflation and how much money I'm making.
So these tariffs that are going into effect, that's not reflected in this latest number, right? So what could we possibly see? And it's interesting because, and you and I have talked about this for the last year, during the Biden administration, we saw inflation coming down. But what was the refrain from, mom and dad and ordinary people on Main Street? Well, the numbers may show one thing, but we're still feeling it at the pump, at the gas station, at the grocery store, with airfares. It seems like it's a little bit of that here. Inflation is coming down on paper, but people are still feeling high prices.
Yeah, and let's remember, just because the inflation rate is coming down, that doesn't mean your prices are going down. It's that your prices are rising at a slower rate than they were. So that's always important to keep in mind. And of course, the White House is celebrating this today, which, look, this is actually a very good report for their first month. But you mentioned the tariffs. How is that going to impact the next couple of months? This report specifically, we got about 10% of, we got a 10% tariff on China at the beginning of February. It does get a little bit of that impact, but really what people are looking at are these 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel, these reciprocal tariffs that are coming April 2nd. So that's going to be these next few reports. How much of the pass-through are you going to get from businesses passing that on to consumers, and does that tick inflation up higher?
So on CBS Mornings, you had a really fascinating report looking at the tariffs and how it's going to impact the cost of aluminum and steel. It's really, really interesting what you uncovered over the last couple of days. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, so you think aluminum and steel, you think cars. We actually went to a brewery because what does your favorite West Coast IPA come in? It comes in a can or a tall boy. And so what we were talking to them about is this aluminum and steel, they're going to get that mostly from Canada, and they're going to see an increase about 5 to 10 cents per can. So you kind of think about a case in general, that's going to be about $1.50, $2. And they're a craft brewery. There are often cheaper, other options on the market. The other thing is the grain.
Yeah.
We also are looking at a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico come April 2nd, when the goods that are not covered under USMCA go through. And what do you need? You need the hops and everything. And so they're also going to be dealing with an increase in cost, not just on the material, the packaging, but also the inputs of the beer. So you often think about cars and the home industry, but really these tariffs, just impact everything possible that you can imagine.
Yeah, we do have a soundbite that we want to play for our viewers that specifically relates to the what we're talking about here. Let's see it.
Well, as prices go up, we're going to have to, there's two ways that they're going to get absorbed. One is by the builder, which eats into the builder's margins, or two, and probably the most likely scenarios, those costs are going to be passed on to the ultimate homeowner or renter in the form of higher costs.
So there, we're still talking about aluminum and steel, but now it's related to people and home building. And I've heard this from a lot of economists as well, that this is going to impact home builders.
Yes, and think about all of the different places that have just had natural disasters in the past year that really need to rebuild, construction in general. Aluminum and steel, you think of the frame of the house, that's a big one. And so the question is, are builders going to eat that cost? Probably not. And we're already seeing prices when it comes to homes, mortgage rates. It just is such a tough time for anyone trying to get into the home market that could make it worse.
I think you're right. Probably not is the answer I'd go with. Kelly, always great to have you in Studio 55. Thanks, my friend. Appreciate it. All right. The Department of Education is closed today for security reasons following an announcement that its staff is being slashed by nearly 50%. Education Secretary Linda McMahon called it a significant step towards restoring the greatness of the U.S. education system. CBS News congressional correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns is outside the Department of Education. So Linda McMahon weighing in, that great legal and education scholar. Caitlin, why were employees told to stay home?
Hey, Vlad. Well, they were actually sent this kind of cryptic email yesterday saying you have to evacuate the building by 6 p.m. It's going to be closed again through Wednesday without really giving a reason as to why. They noted security concerns, but we've been standing out here since about 6:30 this morning, and we haven't seen any such concerns. After staff received that email, we then learned, and they then learned, that half of the staff at the agency was put on administrative leave. That's about 1,500, over 1,500 members or employees put on administrative leave. Now, the agency says that they will continue to service core programs of the department, but this is also making clear this is the first step of dismantling this agency. The president has made clear, not only while he's been in office, but over and over again on the campaign trail, that he wants to abolish the Department of Education. Linda McMahon said in an interview just yesterday that these firings are the first step in that effort.
So Caitlin, I was a kid when the Department of Education was born. As you know, it came about during the Carter administration. My mom was a single mom, just gone through a divorce. She was back in school. I was on one of those free lunch programs for a couple of years. Could we be talking about the loss of programs like that are so critical? I'm just thinking back to myself and how instrumental it was to my well-being while my mother was getting back on her feet. Could programs like that be lost?
Yeah, and that is the biggest concern, Vlad. Here's what we know. First of all, to get rid of the Department of Education, you have to have Congress decide that. It was implemented by Congress, and to be taken apart has to be done by Congress. But what we're seeing here is kind of following the pattern of what we saw with USAID, another agency that abolishing that would require an act of Congress. So they're figuring out ways to kind of get around this by dismantling the agency and moving some of these programs in their plan to other agencies. So there's a lot of confusion sometimes about what the Department of Education does. Local and state governments are the ones that fund the bulk of public schools. The Department of Education just provides a small sliver of it. But what the department does do is provide programs that you just mentioned. enforcing civil rights laws, servicing students with disabilities, funding those schools, funding low-income schools through Title I, administering Pell Grants and federal student loans. Those are the things that the department does. Now, in her confirmation hearing, Linda McMahon did acknowledge that Congress has to play a role if they want to abolish it altogether. But she did say that some of those key programs, like students with disabilities and others, would be moved to different agencies. So there are a lot of questions about what that would actually look like and whether those programs would be serviced the same way they are through this agency.
Critical reporting there from Caitlin Huey-Burns outside of the Department of Education for us this morning. Thank you, Caitlin. All right, the case of a pro-Palestinian activist that was arrested over the weekend goes before a federal judge in New York City this morning. Mahmoud Khalil won't attend the hearing because he's still being held at an ICE facility 1,000 miles away in Louisiana. CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman is outside the federal courthouse in New York City and joins me now. So what can we expect today, Katrina?
Good morning, Vlad. So one thing we're expecting during this court conference is a discussion about jurisdiction. As you mentioned, Mahmoud Khalil was brought to Louisiana, where he's in a detention center that's also notorious for its terrible conditions. Speaking with legal sources last night, they say this is also a way to separate him from his attorneys, from his families, and to put him in the Fifth Circuit, which is known as a much more conservative court district. So they'll be discussing the jurisdiction of where this case can move forward, as well as his attorneys have requested a temporary restraining order to have him returned to New York. We're also expecting there could be some general scheduling and really hoping to get a better understanding of what the government's basis is for arresting and deporting Khalil.
Yeah, I watched a press conference that House Speaker Mike Johnson did when he was asked specifically what laws did Mahmoud Khalil break. He didn't answer the question. So you're an attorney. What is the legal basis for his arrest? What are they saying? What laws are they saying he broke?
The truth is, his attorneys really don't know yet. The government hasn't said, outside of some things we've heard from the White House and in social media statements. But what's really interesting, Vlad, is it sounds like they're trying to rely on this very obscure provision of immigration law that essentially says that the Secretary of State has the right to deport someone if their presence in the United States is adverse to U.S. foreign policy interests. And this is a provision that has also been rarely adjudicated. And I've learned that it has a really interesting history because back in the 1990s, there was a court case that was presided over by President Trump's own sister, the now deceased Judge Marianne Barry, and she found this provision to be unconstitutionally vague and to violate due process. That was then actually ultimately dismissed because it went up to the Third Circuit, where then Judge Alito was a judge, now a Supreme Court justice, of course, and he found that she actually didn't have jurisdiction over the case. But there is this very interesting history of that provision that is tied to President Trump.
Yeah, it would strike me that the situation with Hamas is one that the Israelis are dealing with. This is a war that is being fought by the Israelis and Hamas militants and not here in the United States. So the question, of course, becomes then what is the national security interest that the United States sees in applying that to this guy. And then, of course, the other question is, I know Lily Luciano has been reporting on this as well, and they're looking into if he at any point during those protests voiced any support for Hamas and Hamas's terrorist activities. So far as I can tell, they haven't found any proof of that.
Vlad, that's what I'm hearing as well from talking to sources. And, you know, they also have to really make a strong tie to bring this case against him. Normally, lawful permanent residents are deported due to criminal convictions. This is a very rare case that we have here. And legal sources I've talked to are also very concerned about the chilling effect that it could have. While there are these immigration issues, a really core issue here is the First Amendment and the right to free speech.
Yeah, so and I guess the last point that I'll make, Katrina, and you can address this because you have a legal background and I don't, which is that in years past, the United States has deported individuals who are legal residents for being anarchists or for being communists in the 1950s. And some of these court cases went as high as the Supreme Court. And as far as I could tell, many times the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government. If you were an anarchist and you were not an American citizen, even if you had legal rights here and you were a legal citizen as it was defined back then, you would still be deported. But it doesn't appear that that seems to apply here, given, again, that we have not been able to uncover any support or ties to Hamas, which is a terrorist organization.
Yes, that's very true, Vlad. And I think the really important thing to emphasize here is that even as a non-citizen, as a green card holder in this country, you have First Amendment rights to free speech. And the real concern here is whether this is going to chill protests across the country. I was speaking with a source at Columbia last night who was just talking about the culture of fear on that campus right now among international students in particular. They are carrying their passports. They are talking about no longer attending graduate school in the United States. So there could be a lot of repercussions to this.
All right, Katrina Kaufman applying a much sharper mind and intellect than I possibly ever could. I'm still trying to unbundle all of this because it's kind of a complicated and a very nuanced issue. So I'm glad you're here to provide some clarity for us. Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you, Vlad.
Lawmakers move closer to avoiding a government shutdown. Details on the measure the House just passed. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Congress is inching closer to avoiding a potential government shutdown. House Republicans narrowly passed a 6-month spending bill yesterday with just one Republican voting no. The bill now heads to the Senate, where it will need Democratic support to pass there. The deadline to reach an agreement is midnight on Friday. CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small is on Capitol Hill. So, as we just indicated, Torian, the CR narrowly passed the House. The Senate is a much different prospect. It strikes me that most members, Democrat and Republican, don't like to see government shut down. So the question is, do the Republicans have the votes to get this to the president's desk?
No, quite frankly. I mean, they don't even have the full support of their own conference. Senator Rand Paul was the first one to come out and say he, like his colleague in the House from Kentucky, Thomas Massey, will be a hard no on this bill because the cuts in it just aren't deep enough. Those cuts, though, were concerning enough for Democrats to say at large they won't be supporting this. Though we did see one Democrat in the House support that in Josh Golden. He said that he supported this because he didn't want to see a cut down. He thought the characterization of this bill was a bit misleading and dishonest from Democrats, but the rest of the Democratic Party didn't agree with that, including Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. He's directing his conference to vote against this, so it's unlikely that Republicans will get the numbers here. And just to lay out the math, normally because of the makeup of the Senate, Republicans would have to seek, in order to avoid a filibuster, about 7 Democrats to come across the aisle to vote for them. With Rand Paul's no, that means there are now 8 Democrats who would have to join in order for this bill to make it to the president's desk.
So that's kind of intriguing, Tori. And it does strike me then that there's going to have to be a lot of whipping going on in the Senate over the next couple of days. What are you hearing just from your sources of the prospects of that happening, getting this to the president's desk?
Yeah, it's quite clear that Republicans don't have the numbers. I mean, again, Rand Paul being the biggest person to say no. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska also gave a floor speech yesterday saying that Republicans are facing, and I should say lawmakers, not just Republicans, but they're facing these two untenable scenarios. One in which the government shut down because they can't get consensus on this. And the other is a continuing resolution that she doesn't agree with because in her speech, she said it's pulling back, scaling back the progress that they have made throughout this appropriations process. So that's at least 2 either on the fence or no Republicans. In terms of Democrats, it's clear that they want to stay united on this, show a united front in opposition of this. But we know that the strategy for Republicans moving forward is to lay the blame of a shutdown at the feet of Democrats if that happened. So it's likely what we'll see happen over the next couple of days is last-minute scrambling to maybe get an alternative bill that both sides can agree on in order to avoid a government shutdown. Again, politically, optics would not be in the favor of the Republican Party if this does happen, even though they are placing the blame squarely at the feet of Democrats, Vlad.
It would be interesting to see then, Torian, at the end of the day, because as you know, members of Congress are elected for 2 years, but in the Senate, it's 6 years. So who's up for re-election in the midterms, and where do they stand when it comes to something like this? If they think that they can outlast Donald Trump, then maybe that factors into the calculus as well. So really, really interesting. All right, my friend, thank you very much. Well, let us know if you hear anything new. Still ahead, folks, what we know about the ongoing effort to save hundreds of hostages from a hijacked train in Pakistan. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Here is a look at some of the top stories we're following for you this morning. The accused Gilgo Beach serial killer is expected back in court today. There have been multiple hearings recently over whether DNA evidence in the case is admissible. Rex Heuermann's legal team wants the judge to throw out the test results, questioning the lab involved. Prosecutors maintain the results are reliable. They say DNA evidence links Heuermann to 6 of the 7 victims he's accused of killing on New York's Long Island more than a decade ago. He has pleaded not guilty. In Pakistan, security forces are battling a band of armed militants who took more than 400 people hostage on a train. Officials say the militants were wearing explosive vests when they hijacked the train inside a tunnel in a remote area of the country last night. So far, more than 150 passengers have been rescued. Hundreds of troops have been deployed to try and free the remaining hostages. A Liberation Army group is claiming responsibility for the attack. The group's leaders claim they are willing to let people go in exchange for jailed militants to be released. Pakistan's government has denied such demands in the past. And British police arrested the captain of the cargo ship that crashed into a U.S. oil tanker off the coast of England earlier this week. He was detained on suspicion of gross negligent manslaughter, but has not been charged yet. Officials say one crew member of the cargo ship is still missing and presumed dead. The other 36 crewmen from both ships survived. All right, the U.S. has resumed sending military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine after Kyiv said it was ready to accept a 30-day ceasefire with Russia, following some very high-level face-to-face talks that happened in Saudi Arabia yesterday. Now, the deal will now be presented to Moscow, but it's unclear if the Kremlin will agree to some of those terms.
We're going to bring it to them directly. We're going to say that Ukraine is prepared to stop all battlefield activity and begin the immediate process of negotiating an enduring end to the war. And we'll see what their response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear.
So joining us for now on this is CBS News senior foreign correspondent Holly Williams, who's joining us from Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Holly, so you've just come from a press conference with President Zelensky. What's he saying this morning?
Good morning, Vlad. Well, President Zelensky was extremely positive about those talks yesterday in Saudi Arabia with the U.S., reiterating a point made by the U.S. side that the ball is now very much in Russia's court. Zelensky suggested that if Russia doesn't agree to a 30-day ceasefire, then the U.S. could take powerful steps. Now, this is no doubt a confusing, even dizzying time in American diplomacy. Remember, it was just 12 days ago when we saw that contentious, explosive meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump at the White House. Following that, the U.S. suspended the delivery of military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, seeming to upend America's Ukraine policy. Now, though, the U.S. seems to be back in Ukraine's corner. President Zelensky today seemed to suggest that the two sides had hit the reset button. He said the meeting in Saudi Arabia broke down Russia's attempt to escalate things between the U.S. and Ukraine. Now, I asked him about comments he made last week suggesting that President Trump was living in a disinformation space created initiated by Russia. And he had a really interesting response. Zelensky said that where there's a lack of communication, there's a void, and it's filled with disinformation. And he said that he wanted Ukraine's American friends to visit this country more and see the reality on the ground. You may remember during that explosive meeting at the White House, Zelensky very pointedly asked Vice President J.D. Vance if he had been to Ukraine.
He replied that he'd seen reports on the internet, which I guess is what a vice president does. But I'm curious about the response from the Kremlin, Holly. Because the question, of course, that Zelensky has been asking, or the question that he's hoping to have answered, is whether or not there are any security guarantees. Even if this peace holds, the guarantees that Vladimir Putin won't arbitrarily decide to do away with the fragile peace like he did when it came, for example, to the Minsk Accord. So if the idea is that there will be some concessions that Ukraine will have to make, some concessions the Russians will have to make, how sure are we that Vladimir Putin will go for that?
We're not sure at all. I mean, we heard from Russia's presidential spokesman today who said that they are closely studying the statements that came out of that meeting in Saudi Arabia. That is a very cautious response from Russia. President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected to travel to Russia later on this week for meetings. Look, we can only speculate about Russia's thinking or Vladimir Putin's thinking at this point. On the one hand, Russia currently holds the momentum on the battlefield, so, he may not want a ceasefire. On the other hand, Russia, like Ukraine, is thought to have taken hundreds of thousands of military casualties during this war. And during 3 years of conflict, Russia has only succeeded in taking about 20% of this country. So if there's a face-saving way out of the conflict, maybe Vladimir Putin wants to take it. Also, maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't want to anger President Trump. We may know more on this in the days to come.
All right, very interesting. Holly Williams reporting from Kyiv this morning for us. Thank you, Holly, as always. We appreciate it. All right, for more insight and analysis, let's bring in John Alterman. He is a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the director of the Middle East Studies program. I guess the first question, Jonathan, is how did the Saudis become a major player in negotiating these talks between Ukraine and Russia with the United States?
The Saudis want to be big negotiators in general. They want to provide a venue. Every time there's a Saudi flag, I think they see that helping their branding. It also builds relationships between the foreign minister, the rest of the Saudi leadership, and the U.S. government and leaders around the world. They see this as something they can usefully do to mediate the same way, in many ways, that the Chinese helped mediate the Saudi-Iranian agreement a couple of years ago. I think they see it as something that doesn't cost a lot of money, raises their global profile, and helps their national interests.
So the question that I have now is one that Secretary Rubio sort of alluded to. He says that the ball is now in Russia's court. He says that if they don't agree to this ceasefire, they'll know, and I'm paraphrasing here, where the holdup is and who is roadblocking this road to peace. The question then, of course, then is what would that really mean? The United States has, at least with President Trump, has taken a less than severe approach with Vladimir Putin. They've lifted some of the sanctions that were implemented as a result of their illegal incursion into Ukraine. So is that really the way you read it, that if Vladimir Putin doesn't agree to this, then no, now we know he's the guy who's trying to prevent peace from happening?
I think Vladimir Putin is going to say, well, this is interesting. Let's look at it a little more carefully. Let's study it. As your correspondent suggested, there's some momentum on the battlefield. The problem that Zelensky has is he feels this urgency because of such a bad visit to Washington that went badly off script, or at least his script. I think Putin doesn't feel any urgency. It feels maybe you can draw this out longer, some ambiguity, thinks ultimately Trump is sympathetic, and also thinks that Trump is going to while he's impatient now, he'll get diverted by something else and that'll take the pressure off Russia. So I think the Russian move will be, okay, Zelensky had urgency. He had to do something. Putin doesn't feel urgency. He thinks his patience is going to reward him. And I think what you're going to see is, in response to a move by the United States Russia will try to take its time and explore how much either other things it can trade, other things that the president gets involved with, tariffs, something else, and will be slow, and then see if there's another way to try to prompt urgency in Zelensky, which ultimately is the way the Russians think they're going to continue to move up the chain and win concessions from the Ukrainians.
Last question. Do you think that, as you heard Holly Williams reporting, President Zelensky in a meeting just this morning that she attended, a press conference that Holly attended, suggested that more lawmakers should come to see what the Ukrainians are up against? And she referenced Vice President Vance in the Oval Office when Zelensky offered him to come and visit. He obviously has not visited. He said that he's seen and watched reports. But I wonder, when you have a senator like Mark Kelly, who just came back from Ukraine and saw with his own eyes what the Ukrainians are up against. He was, of course, called a traitor by Elon Musk, who has he's not an elected official at all, calling a decorated veteran, a combat aviator, a traitor for just going to see with his own eyes what is happening, where the money the United States is spending is going. Do you think that more lawmakers should take the same path as Senator Kelly did?
Yeah, I think more lawmakers should try to assess how important Ukraine is. It was very important to the Biden administration, and people were very engaged. I think there is a sense that the Democrats are more engaged, Republicans less engaged. I think Republicans owe it to themselves to be serious. I remember I was in Moscow about 10 years ago, and for the first time, I met a conservative veteran of Republican administrations who was very pro-Russia. This has been a long effort of the Russians to cultivate conservative voices. I think that the Republican Party needs to come to some sort of greater decision about whether Russia is a threat or a potential partner, and how we treat Ukraine and how we treat Russia's actions in Ukraine come from a conclusion on that point. I think for a lot of people, they're concerned with domestic issues, they're concerned with tariffs, they're concerned with other kinds of things. And frankly, what is concerning to me is not so much that people aren't in the right place on Ukraine. I think Ukraine, which to me is an important issue, is not something that enough people have thought through where they stand on. I think it's time for people to be serious about whether this is really a serious national security issue or not. If it is, they should act accordingly.
Yeah, it's such an excellent point, Jonathan, and especially because Vladimir Putin can wait everybody out. He's not going anywhere. He's not held to any kind of electoral cycle. And for him, this is just a waiting game, which is why it's easy to understand why Zelensky would want some security guarantees. All right, John Alterman, thank you very much for your analysis. Really interesting. Appreciate it. All right, in just a few minutes, President Trump will host the leader of Ireland at the White House. The visit comes as the European Union pushes back on the Trump administration's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. CBS News Justice Department correspondent Scott McFarlane is at the White House today. Scott, fun trivia for our audience before we get going. What is the name of the Irish? What is the designation of the Irish Prime Minister, so that our American friends, bet you not even any of the Irish Americans in this room know it. Do you know it?
Designated as the Taoiseach.
Thank you very much.
Is running things in Ireland, and for the day, he is the star of the show here at the White House. They have this whole elaborate setup for the arrival here at the West Wing to meet with President Trump. But the pomp and ceremony is going to quickly shift into some pretty tough business, Vlad. This is happening at a fragile moment in U.S.-European relations, where you have tariffs being threatened, tariffs being enacted, and you also have the battle between the Trump administration and European leaders over who should be spending more to support Ukraine. Should Europe be sharing more of that burden? Should the U.S. continue to share that burden? All these things are going to come up in this conversation at this sensitive moment between the Taoiseach and the president.
Yeah, and we know that, as you know, President Biden was a favorite son of Ireland. When he visited that country a few years ago, there was an amazing reception from the people there. But as you say, immigration has been at the forefront of new administration, and there's some new data from the Irish government that says as many as 10,000 undocumented Irish immigrants are in the United States today. Are there any concerns that they could be potentially targeted in this new crackdown?
Oh, there sure are. Pressing concerns that the tens of thousands of immigrants from Ireland here in the United States are going to be somehow impacted by this border crackdown, this immigration enforcement crackdown the Trump administration is promising. There's concern that it is not being done as diligently as it could otherwise be, and that there's going to be any number of people impacted by it who shouldn't be. Let's put that aside. There's broad economic interests Ireland has in the United States. Those economies in Europe, especially in Ireland, so dependent on good relationships with the United States. And they're trying to foster that through these conversations today as President Trump shatters norms and breaks down a lot of the long-held relationships the U.S. has with its allies.
Very fascinating. I did also see a report this morning, Scott, that a lot of Americans are choosing to move to Ireland, given the political climate here in this country. Really interesting stuff. All right, Scott, thank you very much, my brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vlad.
All right, weather now. Millions of people across the U.S. are bracing for a powerful storm that could bring severe weather as it crosses from California, where the system is already dumping heavy rain and bringing flood risks. Let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with a look at the national forecast. Hey, Grant.
Hey, good morning, Vlad. Yeah, it's another one of those coast-to-coast storms. It's bringing the impact from rain, gusty winds, heavy snow to the west coast. As it moves east of the Rockies later this week into the weekend, it'll start to increase that threat for some severe weather. Let's pull up the map and let's show you the storm system that we're talking about. This next atmospheric river event is already impacting portions of Northern California into the Pacific Northwest. There you see a lot of rainfall. There is some snow up into the higher elevations, but for the most part, heavy rainfall is going to be an increasing concern, especially as this whole weather maker moves down the coast and then eventually starts to move to the east. Let's track this storm system out here for you as we go through the next couple of days. Again, bringing heavy rainfall, and that will be an increasing concern for some flooding, especially over those burn scar areas over Southern California as we go into the day tomorrow. But watch how this storm system just takes over the whole west coast and then starts to move into the mountains. That's where we could see up to 4 feet of snow. Good for some of the ski resorts out there, but once it moves east, looking at that low pressure system tapping into moisture out of the Gulf, that will fuel quite a bit of a severe weather threat, multi-day severe weather threat that will lead us all the way through the weekend. Vlad, we'll have to stay very aware of those weather conditions as we go from Friday, Saturday into Sunday. Back to you.
All right, Grant, thank you. Houthi rebels say they are going to ramp up attacks against Israeli ships. Why now and how this escalation could impact the tenuous situation in the region. Streaming CBS News 24/7. Yemen's Houthi rebels say they will resume attacks on Israeli ships in response to Israel's continued aid blockade in Gaza. The militant group's decision comes as the future of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas remains uncertain. So following the latest from Tel Aviv for us is CBS News foreign correspondent Ramy Inocencio. Ramy, you're back in the region. So break down this decision by the Houthis to resume attacks on Israeli ships. And does it mark a return to perhaps a little bit of escalation in the region, even though that the ceasefire is still holding?
Sure. Well, it opens a door to potential attacks by the Houthis against Israeli ships in the waters surrounding this region. But the reason they have decided to make a U-turn on this original suspension of attacks on Israeli ships, which started back in January when the ceasefire did take effect, is because of the blockade that Israel has said that it is now doing on the Gaza Strip in terms of humanitarian assistance, food, aid, medical supplies. In addition, the ending, the stoppage of electricity flowing into the Gaza Strip that just happened about 3 days ago, which has affected the functioning of desalination plants there. So far, this has been announced this announcement came last night, but we haven't gotten any reports of any attacks just yet. But looking back on it, we know that the Houthis do have the capability to do these attacks. They have launched about 100 attacks ever since the October 7th attacks of 2023. There are at least 2 ships that were attacked. One was seized. At least several sailors were killed, and many others were taken captive. So the waters here from the Gulf of Aden all the way to the Arabian Sea, all fair game, according to Houthis, from this point on.
And finally, Ramy, how is the continuation of that ceasefire and those talks around it going?
Sure. Well, that is why Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, is now in Doha talking with the Israeli delegation, talking with those mediators from Egypt and Qatar, and then indirectly with Hamas. The crux of this is that Israel wants to extend phase one of the ceasefire from January, but Hamas wants to carry on with phase two, which was agreed by both Israel and Hamas 7, 8 weeks ago. There is a plan being talked about now called the Witkoff plan. If that did come to some kind of fruition, it envisions an extension of 2 months and the resumption of the exchange of hostages. Roughly half are believed to still be alive, about 25 in total, potentially over the next 2 months. Vlad.
All right, Ramy Inocencio reporting from Tel Aviv for us. Thank you, Ramy. All right, the astronauts who went to space for 8 days and stayed for more than 9 months may soon be on their way home. Coming up, we've got an update on the mission to bring them back to Earth. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. A SpaceX launch slated for later today could pave the way for the crew of the Boeing Starliner to finally return home. Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams have been at the International Space Station since June, when their 8-day trip turned into a months-long stay. According to CBS News senior national correspondent Mark Strassman, they could be home in just a matter of days.
The mission for tonight's launch, the group of 4 astronauts heading up to the space station, really is unchanged. It's just part of the regular rotation of astronauts aboard the International Space Station. What is different is that 2 of the astronauts that they're going to replace have become very high profile over the last 9 months or so, simply because their stay has been extended and their stay has become a bit of a political issue, with claims by the Trump White House that they were abandoned or stuck in space because of inaction by the Biden administration.
Well, the astronauts told CBS News they have enjoyed their time in space and were prepared for the chance of an extended stay. Today's launch is set for just before 8 p.m. Eastern. Their return is expected sometime early next week. Let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the last look at the national forecast. I could see them, Grant, getting off that spacecraft and looking around and seeing all the stuff that's changed in the last 8 months since they've been gone, and being like, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm just going to get back up there and I'll be good. I'll see you in a couple of years.
I'll tell you what, it's got to be weird enough coming back from space, right? Just the way your body feels and being up in that zero gravity environment, but then to come back in a very different situation for sure. Weather-wise, though, it's actually relatively calm through a good majority of the country. We've got this Pacific storm system that will be moving from west to east across the country in the coming days. So for now, all the rain and even some high elevation snow out west. Meanwhile, very warm conditions across much of the eastern half of the United States. Vlad, back to you.
All right, Grant, thank you very much. Folks, that does it for me, but stay right where you are. After the break, Mugo D-Way is live from San Francisco with all the news breaking from coast to coast. I'll see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. This is CBS News 24/7.